Welcome back. Well, we broke at a point where we were looking at what happens when somebody gets sort of intractable and stuck in their position. And I was thinking on the break that I could relate to that feeling of this is never going to work. I mean, I've certainly occasionally sat with a couple in couples therapy, and we've seen each other maybe 5 or 6 times, and I have this sense that, you know, I'm just really referring them to you next would be what we do. And then the very next week they come in and there's been all this movement, and I often think that it reminds me a lot of recovery in the sense that something happens or people inside of them for whatever reason are ready. And that sort of magic readiness that I think is very hard to predict. And you're right in terms of you just stick with it, you know, and sooner or later it happens. I think also it must help them that to know that you believe in it enough to stick with it. Because it's sort of like, well, if John's willing to stick this out, there must be something to it. We'll try one more time.
Well, I actually do a lot of mediations pro bono or for free, court-ordered type mediations, and then even my hourly rate is substantially less than my attorney's fees. So the people know I have an investment in the process right off the bat. You talked about one of your earlier graphics was having a stake in the process. They come to me because they know I have a stake in the practice. I'm not in it for the money. I'm not in it for the prestige at all.
Okay.
It's because I really love it. And
yeah, it sounds like it's a heart mission for you. Let's take a look at our next graphic that were recommended steps for us, which would be inventing options for mutual gain. So avoiding premature judgments and searching for one answer, and looking again for shared interest and mutual gain. So it looks like that avoiding that one right answer sounds very key.
Well, it is. I was going to speak about the other one, the shared gain, because if you can find a common interest, it's very easy to resolve the problem because they're coming from their own selfishness anyway. And that's really fun to do those. I have an interesting anecdote about the one about avoid finding a fixed position.
Okay.
I was doing a couple who was separating, and they had one house, and initially the wife wanted the house, and she was adamant that she was going to buy the house and he was going to have to move. And then during the course of the mediations, and we met maybe twice a month for a number of months, she met a man who had a house in Santa Cruz, and suddenly her whole position changed, and she now wanted to sell the house and didn't want to buy it. And so again, you never know how these things are going to play out.
Okay. So definitely there became something in it for her to shift her position. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, and I think you make an interesting point, which is, again, the presence of a third party.
Right.
Which is, I think, particularly if there's children involved or relatives or a family business, that must make it somewhat more complicated, I would think, at times.
Families are an ideal situation to mediate. Even non-traditional families like communes or nonprofit organizations that are communities. I do a fair amount of work in the gay lesbian community because they don't have the access to the courts that some people do, and they've got to work it out between themselves honorably. Will disputes are really, I've probably got 4 or 5 of those in the last year or two, either inheritance debates or others, because they all have the selfish interest of dividing the pot as wisely as they can with as much left for them. If they get lawyers involved, then, you know, the lawyers eat up the first 10 or 20% of it right off the top.
Yeah. That, you know, that must be interesting for you in terms of one half of your life professionally. You're charging, I'm sure, normal lawyer fees.
Outrageous fees.
Which are, you know, yes, they're high. But as we also learned a couple of weeks ago in this business about collaborative divorce, I mean, actually, one of the reasons you're paid what you're paid is you do a lot of things the rest of us would rather not do. I mean, you're willing to walk into arenas and file paperwork and take on unpleasant people that. That's why we're paying you, you know, so that we don't have to do it. But what I was thinking is it must be interesting that you have this one role in one part of your life where you have to walk in an adversarial system, and the other side you're not. I mean, how do you change hats?
Well, my law practice is very specialized. It's a very narrow niche. It's bankruptcy and business reorganizations.
Okay.
And I do litigation in there, but the law is very clear-cut and it's very separate. So I can split that in my mind really easily.
Okay.
The rest of the arena is all mediation. And so I don't have any stake in any of that, and I don't have a problem with that. I never saw myself, believe it or not, as a lawyer. Even when I went to law school and became an attorney, it was never my dream. And so when I had that experience in the parking lot where I knew that I wasn't a lawyer, it wasn't like a big letdown. It was like, that's right, I'm not. So I have a lot of fun actually teasing lawyers and making wisecracks about lawyers.
Okay.
The parties naturally know how much money they're saving. I mean, I'll be honest, there's a significant savings in mediation as opposed to litigation. Once they get clued in on that, then a lot of times they'll joke about it.
Okay.
They want to meet with me without their lawyers sometimes, for example. And the lawyers basically are fine with that because they know that if their clients are happy, they're going to get future referrals and future business.
There is that key. It is very much like my business, a word-of-mouth business. So you're right. Everybody has a stake in this going well. Let's take a look at some more advice that they have for us about negotiation. Insisting on using objective criteria, which is trying to reach a result based on fair standards and procedures rather than force of will, and yielding to principles you've agreed upon and not pressure. So it sounds like part of the negotiation process is agreeing on a set of standards, criteria.
Once we go through the understanding the position process and clarifying what the issues are, it's another one of these sleight of hands things. If you can get them off of the dollar amount and onto an objective formula that they believe is fair and then plug the dollars in later, for example, and that's what they're talking about. Getting away from a fixed position, I need X dollars for recovery, and saying, what's a fair result here? What would be fair? Well, 2/3 of the net of this would be about a fair percentage or something like that.
Okay.
And so you just use it as a way just to get around their prejudice that they came in on.
Okay, yeah, because I imagine that the dollar amounts would really trigger that emotional response. I mean, and we know because we had, Darcy, you know her, Darcy Reagan on, talking about financial issues and that money is very emotional for a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah. And the second point that you raised, which dealt with the force of will, a mediated settlement is essentially a consensual win-win situation. And if one side is using intimidation tactics and the other side's capitulating, it's not a true mediation. It's essentially exploitive. So my role is to keep the tables very even, keep the playing field very even. I'll go so far as to give people who normally don't talk extra time to talk, and I'll say, you have got to talk to make this thing work. And of course, they're really kind of shy and kind of quiet and used to the other person making all the sounds. And I ask them specifically to speak up just to keep the playing field even.
Okay. Yeah, I would say that's very important for you to encourage the fact. Particularly, I would guess if it's like a couple and maybe over the years her self-esteem or his self-esteem is really diminished and so has reached a point, one of the reasons they're getting divorced is she's feeling like it doesn't even matter what I say anyway.
Yeah. And I can step in sometimes once I've got their confidence. An example would be maybe the husband's really good with the money and he's handled all the finances all the time, and the wife really is overwhelmed by the whole subject. And so I will then kind of become her surrogate in a way, and I'll go through the numbers with him, with her listening, but she doesn't really understand, but she trusts that if I understand it's comprehensible and if I have a sense that it's fair, it's fair. And it's very interesting to watch that. It's probably in your business transference or projection or something like that. But there's a certain alliance to getting to the truth. And once there's some semblance of truth, then the people are basically trusting and go forward.
Okay. So a lot of it does hinge upon their belief in your good intentions.
Yeah, yeah. That's my natural bias.
Well, yeah, but I think trusting, particularly when you're in an emotionally difficult place, I think is always a challenge.
Yeah.
You know.
And sometimes it's very heated. I mean, emotionally difficult is an understatement of the tensions and betrayals that some people are dealing with here. And a lot of times I don't know what the agenda is until afterwards. But there'll be something in the back of my mind that I know that there's an issue here that I don't understand completely. And I'll have to, kind of get centered and say, what is really going on here? What's the real agenda?
Okay. I would guess that's true, that people might not always be totally upfront, and then you discover it in the middle of the room. Now, if you discover some sort of unspoken nasty agenda, do you call a break until you can process that, or do you just keep rolling right along and put it on the table, like you said?
You brought up several possibilities. One possibility I might do is take a break with one party and visit with them and caucus with them for a few minutes and then meet with the other party and caucus with them. And that's to find out if this issue has to be resolved to settle or not. And I'll basically be very open-ended about it. I don't have a judgment that it needs to be or doesn't need to be, but I do want them to know that I'm aware that there's something going on and it's not clear to me what's happening. There's something else they need to tell me in confidence or something like that. And sometimes it's very, very personal stuff that they have to share, that they have to resolve. And sometimes it's very, very petty stuff that they have a resentment from years ago, and they'll be fighting about a sofa. And it's just absurd why there's such heat on the sofa until we get to the underlying issue, which is, she paid for it on his credit card, and, he had to pay it off and couldn't go fishing that weekend, or, whatever it is. And, the emotional issue comes up, and then it's done, it's gone.
Okay. Yeah. Now, do you ever involve counselors in this process?
I have done a couple of mediations with women therapists. My initial vision in doing family law mediation was to do it in conjunction with a female counselor so that we had gender neutrality. Basically the problem with that is the therapists charge more money than the couple can afford to pay two professionals to do one thing. So I really have not pursued that. I'm very open to it. I invite the idea quite strongly because there is a gender difference, and I've had to do a lot of gender awareness work inside of my own process because I'm a man and I naturally think the way that I've been trained to think as a man, lawyer, whatever. Right. And I need to be really clear on that and really careful.
Well, and one of the things that we were commenting on in the break is as a male lawyer, lawyers in general, you're very verbal. You're trained to be very verbal. And so I would guess that for people who are less verbal, you know, being able to communicate with them in their language, you know, which is more body language, in tone of voice.
Well, I've done a lot of mediations for ethnic communities, actually. Some Indian couples, and also some for legal aid down in downtown San Jose, where you have tenant rights situations and they're disputing with their landlord. And some of the landlords are, you know, one ethnicity and the tenant's another ethnicity. It's very interesting to watch the dynamics of how people communicate and how they say one thing and mean something else, or they have a typical style of domination or aggression that is completely inappropriate to the circumstances, but that's their only style of dealing with it.
Okay. And so maybe then it sounds like you get the opportunity to do some education yourself.
Right.
Which is, gee, it might be more effective if, you know, you try this approach. Or
that's when I got to go to the bigger picture that I talked about earlier, finding out what the real common interest is. Because as a human, there is a common interest somewhere between every person.
Sure there is. Now, do you ever see people come to a decision in mediation that personally you don't agree with? Yeah. Yeah? Yeah. And how do you, what do you do with that inside of you?
It depends on how out of balance it feels. If the parties are overreaching, then I'm a little bit uncomfortable, and I've actually talked to one before in a mediation and said, I'm not comfortable with this, are you sure you want to do this? This woman was waiving spousal support, and I just didn't feel like, and she was entitled to maybe 5 or 8 years worth of support, and I was a little uncomfortable with that. And she said, John, the truth is his parents bought the house. They basically gave us the money. She said, I don't feel it's right for me to take money. And, you know, she got the equity of the house, and she just felt it was fair. Once she explained that to me, I was fine. Other times, it's clearly my prejudice, and I have to just let it be. One big mistake I made one time in the early mediations, there was this divorced couple that was fighting about taxes. And I looked, and each of them had support people there with them that kind of bolster them and all that. And they'd been divorced a long time. And then so they had an agreement, and then I said to the ex-wife, are you willing to forgive him? Well, that was a big mistake. You know, that was, again, my agenda, not their agenda. Okay, so you've kind of, like the rest of us, you sort of learn through experimenting and trial and error what works and what doesn't. I want to thank you for coming down and sharing your expertise with us. All right. It's certainly been interesting, and I've learned something. Thank you for joining us. Tune in next week as we look at learning disabilities and chemical dependency treatment. I'm Mary Crocker Cook. Good night.